The year is 1350. Outside your door, the December wind howls like a pack of wolves, which, coincidentally, are also outside your door. The temperature in your home hovers just above freezing, despite the fire crackling in the centre of your dirt floor. Your breakfast, a bowl of watery gruel that tastes vaguely of turnips and regret. Your heating system, a hole in your roof that lets out smoke and lets in snow, rain, and the occasional bird. Welcome to winter in medieval Europe, where the season wasn't measured in months but in how many family members you'd bury before spring. Strip away your thermostat, your insulated walls, your refrigerator full of food, and your medicine cabinet. Replace them with a drafty hut, a dwindling pile of firewood, and the very real possibility that a common cold could kill you. This is the reality that awaited medieval peasants every October when the harvest ended and the battle for survival began. Contemporary medieval writers didn't mince words about winter. They associated it directly with old age, poverty, and death. And they weren't being dramatic. When 1 out of every 10 people in your village might not see spring, when children routinely froze to death in their beds, when entire families resorted to eating tree bark and boiled leather just to fill their stomachs, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a killer wearing a crown of ice. Let's start with where you'd be living, if you can call it that. Picture a structure that's less cosy cottage and more badly assembled pile of sticks held together by mud and prayer. Your average peasant home was built from wattle and daub, essentially a wooden frame filled with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung! Your walls were literally made of manure. These walls cracked constantly as the daub dried and crumbled, creating gaps where winter wind whistled through like nature's own air conditioning. Except, you desperately didn't want it. The thatch roof above your head? Sure, it was a foot thick, but it also had a massive hole cut into it. Not because medieval architects were incompetent, but because without that hole, the smoke from your fire would kill you before the cold could. This meant snow fell directly into your living room. Medieval illustrations actually show peasants sitting indoors with snow landing on them while they huddle by the fire. One 15th century drawing depicts peasants literally lifting their tunics to warm their bare buttocks by the flames. Modesty was a luxury you couldn't afford when frostbite threatened your nethers. Your floor was packed earth covered with straw that gradually turned into a putrid mulch of mud, food scraps, and human waste. Windows? If you were lucky, you had small openings covered with oiled cloth that let in a dim, greasy light. Glass was for churches and nobles, not for you. The typical peasant cottage measured maybe 15 by 30 feet for your entire family, parents, children, grandparents, and on the coldest nights, your livestock too. That's right, you'd bring the pig inside, not because you loved the pig, though you'd grown attached, but because that pig represented months of meals, and if it froze to death, your family might starve. So you'd share your already cramped space with a 200-pound pig, some chickens, maybe a goat. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting straw, and whatever was bubbling in the eternal pot of pottage. Medieval builders did try some clever tricks. Houses were often built on raised mounds to avoid the worst of the damp. Some regions used cob, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, which held heat slightly better than wattle and daub. In the coldest regions, they'd bank earth against the walls for insulation, essentially building a house that was half buried. But these improvements were marginal. A modern person would still find it unbearably cold, dark, and filthy. At the centre of your one-room hovel sat your only source of warmth, an open fire pit. No chimney, no fireplace, just a circle of stones on the dirt floor with flames that had to burn constantly or you'd freeze. The smoke had nowhere to go except up through that hole in your roof, eventually. First, it filled your home, stinging your eyes, blackening your lungs, and coating everything in a layer of soot. But here's the real nightmare: firewood. A medieval family needed about 45 kilograms of wood every single day just for heating. That's not counting what you needed for cooking. And you couldn't just walk into the forest and take it. Those trees belonged to your lord. Get caught stealing wood and you'd face fines you couldn't pay or worse. The forest laws of medieval England prescribed punishments ranging from massive fines to blinding for poaching the king's timber. Instead, you gathered fallen branches, twigs, and dried peat from bogs. Peat burned slow and hot, but cutting it from frozen bogland in winter was back-breaking work that left you soaked and shivering. The process was miserable. You'd wade into partially frozen bogs, cut blocks of peat with special spades, then haul them home on your back. Each block weighed several pounds when wet. You'd need hundreds for the winter. Run out of fuel in January? Your options were to burn your furniture, your roof beams, or freeze to death. Many chose option 3 by default. There are records of families burning their own homes piece by piece, first the furniture, then the interior walls, finally the roof beams, until the structure collapsed and they died in the ruins. Some tried using portable braziers, metal pans filled with hot coals that could be moved around the room. Sounds clever until you realise these were essentially carbon monoxide factories. Use one in your sealed-up winter hovel and you might never wake up. Knock one over and your house made of straw and dried mud would go up like a torch. The Chronicle of London records numerous deaths from brazier accidents, including an entire family found dead in their beds from carbon monoxide poisoning in 1391. The lucky ones had heated stones, rocks warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth, then tucked into bed. The unlucky ones discovered what happens when a too hot stone meets straw bedding. One medieval account describes an entire village burning down because someone's bed warmer got too enthusiastic. Even maintaining the fire was dangerous. Someone had to stay awake all night to tend it, let it die, and your family might freeze before morning. Too much wood at once and sparks could ignite the thatch roof. Medieval fire tending was an art form born of desperation. You'd bank the coals just right, add wood piece by piece, and pray the wind didn't shift and blow sparks into the straw. Your medieval winter wardrobe was all about one fabric: wool. Wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool leggings, wool everything. Not because it was fashionable, but because wool stayed warm even when wet, and you would be wet constantly from snow, rain, and your own sweat from the endless physical labour required to survive. The wealthy had furs. You had rabbit pelts if you were lucky, cat skin if you were desperate. Yes, cat skin. Medieval sumptuary laws actually specified that peasants could only wear the furs of common animals like cats, rabbits, and foxes. Imagine explaining to your freezing children that they couldn't have warm clothes because the law said ermine was for earls. Underwear was linen, if you had any. Most peasants owned exactly one set of clothes, maybe 2 if they were prosperous. Washing them meant breaking ice on a stream, scrubbing with lye that burned your hands raw, then waiting days for everything to dry by the fire. Days you'd spend naked or wrapped in whatever rags you could find. Most chose to stay dirty. Better to stink than freeze. The layers were crucial. First came the linen undergarments, a long shirt that reached the knees for men, a similar shift for women. Over this, wool tunics, then another tunic, then a cloak. Men wore wool hose, essentially thick tights tied to their belts. Women wore long wool dresses with multiple layers of underskirts. Everyone wore hoods, not attached to anything, just separate hoods that covered the head and shoulders. On top of that, a wool cap, sometimes 2 caps. Shoes were a disaster. Leather boots if you were lucky, but leather isn't waterproof. Your feet would be wet from October to April. Peasants stuffed their shoes with straw or wrapped their feet in extra cloth, but nothing really worked. Frostbite was endemic. Medieval medical texts describe toes turning black and falling off with disturbing regularity. At night, you slept fully clothed, tunic, leggings, cloak, and most importantly a cap. Medieval people knew what modern science has confirmed. You lose enormous amounts of body heat through your head. Going to bed without a nightcap was considered almost suicidal. Families shared beds not for companionship but for survival, piling together under mounds of rough blankets, fully dressed, breathing each other's sick breath all night long. Your winter diet was an exercise in monotony and malnutrition. Every meal centred on 2 things: dark bread made from rye or barley, wheat was for the wealthy, and pottage, a grey slop of whatever vegetables you'd stored boiled into submission. A typical pottage contained dried peas, beans, turnips, onions and barley, all thrown into a pot with water and cooked until it formed a paste with the consistency of wallpaper glue and significantly less flavour. If you were fortunate, you might add a bone with a few scraps of meat clinging to it. The pot never stopped cooking. You just add more water and ingredients as needed, creating an eternal stew that got progressively more dubious as winter wore on. By February, that pot had been simmering for 4 months. The bottom was a layer of char, the contents unidentifiable. November was slaughter month. Any pig you couldn't afford to feed through winter got killed, and every part was used. The meat was salted until it could survive a nuclear holocaust, the blood mixed with oats to make black pudding, the intestines stuffed with whatever organs were left to make sausages. By February, that salt pork was your only protein, and it tasted like eating a leather boot that had been soaked in the ocean. The pig slaughter itself was a brutal affair. Multiple families would work together because one family couldn't process a 200-pound pig before it spoiled. They'd kill the pig with a blow to the head, then immediately drain the blood into buckets, waste nothing. The carcass would be scalded with boiling water to remove hair, then butchered with every piece allocated: hams for smoking, sides for bacon, fat rendered into lard, organs into sausages, even the bladder saved to store more lard. The work took all day in freezing temperatures, hands numb from cold and covered in blood. Fresh vegetables, non-existent. Fruit, a memory. Vitamin C, never heard of it. By late winter, scurvy was setting in. Your gums bled, your joints ached, wounds wouldn't heal. The spring sickness people described was likely mild scurvy finally catching up with months of nutritional deficiency. Storage was primitive but crucial. Root vegetables went into pits dug in the floor covered with sand and straw. Grain was stored in sacks that rats constantly tried to raid. One rat infestation could mean starvation. Peasants would stuff rags into every hole, set traps, keep cats, hence why cat fur was available for clothing, and still wake to find their grain stores decimated. Cheese, if you had any, was aged hard enough to break teeth but would last months. Beer was safer to drink than water, and provided desperately needed calories, so even children drank small beer, weak ale that was basically liquid bread. Wine, if available, was often mulled with spices, for those who could afford spices, and heated, one of the few warming pleasures available. By March, if the harvest had been poor, you might be eating bark bread, actual tree bark ground up and mixed with whatever flour remained. Some desperate souls ate famine foods, nettles, acorns, even grass. There are accounts from the Great Famine of 1315-17 of people eating their own children. When chroniclers write about cannibalism, you know things got apocalyptically bad. One chronicle states parents did eat their own children for hunger, while another records people digging up fresh corpses from graveyards. Winter didn't mean rest for medieval peasants. Sure, the fields were frozen, but survival required constant back-breaking work in brutal conditions. Every day brought essential tasks that couldn't wait for better weather. Wood gathering was a daily necessity. Even with a stockpile, you'd need to venture out for kindling and smaller branches. This meant trudging through knee-deep snow to the forest edge, hands so numb you could barely grip the axe, knowing that without enough wood tonight, your family might not wake up tomorrow. The fortunate had sledges to drag wood home. The rest carried it on their backs, making multiple trips, soaked through and exhausted. Water had to be fetched daily from wells or streams. In winter, this meant breaking through ice with rocks or axes, lowering buckets into frigid water, then hauling them back home where they'd freeze again within hours. Spill water on yourself in sub-zero temperatures, and you'd better get inside fast or risk hypothermia. Animals still needed tending. Cattle and sheep had to be fed whatever hay you'd managed to store, their water troughs freed from ice, their shelters mucked out. Sick animals needed care. Lose a cow in winter and your family might starve. All this in weather that could kill you if you stayed outside too long. Indoor work continued too. Women spun thread and wove cloth by firelight, the medieval period's version of a sweatshop, except it was freezing, and the shop was your smoke-filled home. Men repaired tools, made baskets, carved wooden implements. Children carded wool, a tedious job that left hands raw and bleeding from the rough fibres. Your medieval winter home wasn't just cold and smoky, it was a petri dish of disease. Everyone in your family, plus whatever livestock you brought inside for warmth, shared the same air in a sealed space for months. When one person coughed, everyone got sick. Respiratory infections were the real killers. What started as a simple cold could progress to bronchitis, then pneumonia. No antibiotics meant pneumonia was often a death sentence. The constant smoke from your hearth made everything worse, irritating lungs already weakened by cold and damp. Tuberculosis, already endemic, spread rapidly in these conditions. Medieval texts describe the consumption that left victims coughing blood while slowly wasting away. The crowding was devastating for disease transmission. Influenza would tear through a village in days. What medieval people called winter fever or sweating sickness was probably flu, and it killed indiscriminately. Children and elderly were especially vulnerable. In a bad winter, 20% of children might not survive to spring. But disease wasn't the only threat. Hypothermia claimed victims regularly. Fall asleep too far from the fire and you might never wake up. Step outside to relieve yourself at night and collapse in the snow. Your body wouldn't be found until the spring thaw. Frostbite was so common that medieval medical texts devoted whole chapters to it, though their main treatment was try not to let the affected parts rot off. Personal hygiene in winter was essentially non-existent. Lice and fleas lived in the seams of clothes that were never washed. These weren't just uncomfortable, they spread typhus, a disease that could kill within weeks. Your unwashed body, unwashed clothes and unwashed bedding created perfect conditions for infection. A small cut could turn septic. A tooth infection could spread to your brain. Without antibiotics, without even basic antiseptics, your immune system was on its own. Medieval medicine often made things worse. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for fevers, because surely what a sick, malnourished person needs is to lose blood. Healers prescribed pigeon dung poultices for pneumonia, or suggested drinking your own urine for stomach ailments. The lucky might get willow bark tea, containing aspirin's precursor, but most remedies ranged from useless to actively harmful. Beyond the slow killers of cold and disease, winter brought sudden death in numerous creative ways. Ice was a constant hazard. One slip while carrying water or wood could mean a broken hip, and in the medieval world that often meant death. No emergency rooms, no surgery, just lying in bed hoping the bone would heal while infection set in. House fires were devastatingly common. One knocked over candle, one spark from the hearth catching the thatch, and your entire home could be consumed in minutes. In winter, this was a death sentence. Even if you escaped the flames, where would you go? Your neighbours, if they took you in, were already cramped and short on food. Many fire victims simply froze to death afterward. Roof collapses killed entire families. Heavy snow would accumulate on thatch roofs until the weight became too much. The beams would crack, usually at night when everyone was asleep, bringing down tons of snow and timber. A chronicle from 1389 records multiple farmsteads destroyed this way, families crushed in their beds. Getting lost in a blizzard meant certain death. Medieval people had no weather forecasts, no emergency services. Get caught in a sudden snowstorm while travelling between villages, and you'd likely become a frozen corpse found during the spring thaw. Even travelling short distances was potentially lethal. There are accounts of people freezing to death just trying to reach their neighbour's house. Here's the thing about medieval winter survival. You couldn't do it alone. The village had to work together, or everyone died separately. The December pig slaughter was a communal affair. Neighbours helped each other butcher, salt and smoke meat because one family couldn't process an entire pig before it spoiled. The same went for gathering firewood. Groups of men would brave the forest together, sharing tools and labour, then dividing the wood among families. The church, for all its faults, served as a crucial safety net. Monasteries stored grain from tithes and would distribute it during famines, theoretically. Parish churches organised almsgiving. The lord of the manor, if he wasn't a complete bastard, might release emergency stores rather than watch his entire workforce die. After all, dead peasants can't work the fields come spring. But the real survival network was informal. When your neighbour's roof collapsed under snow, everyone helped repair it, because next time it might be yours. When a family ran out of food, others shared what little they had, knowing the favour would be returned. These weren't acts of charity, they were survival insurance. Winter evenings brought communal gatherings that served multiple purposes. Families would crowd into the largest, warmest house to share heat and company. They'd bring their spinning, carving or mending work and labour together by firelight. Stories were told, endless tales of saints, heroes and local legends that could stretch for hours. These gatherings conserved firewood, heating one house instead of 5, and maintained sanity during the darkest months. The psychological support was equally vital. Winter nights were long. In December, darkness lasted 16 hours. Families would gather to share stories, songs, and what passed for entertainment. The 12 days of Christmas weren't just religious observation, they were mandated celebration, a brief respite from the grinding misery. Villages held wassailing ceremonies, played rough games, and drank themselves into temporary forgetfulness. Even the church loosened up, allowing the Feast of Fools where social rules temporarily inverted. Let's be brutally honest about the numbers. In a typical winter, mortality rates jumped significantly. Infants and elderly were most vulnerable. Up to 20% of children might die in a harsh winter. During catastrophes like the Great Famine of 1315-17, entire regions lost 10 to 25% of their population. Some villages simply ceased to exist. The winter of 1363-64 was so cold that the Rhine River froze solid for 70 days. In southern France, a chronicle from 1389 records snow so heavy that many farmsteads were destroyed and many people died because their houses fell down on them. Others died of cold, others of hunger, entire families found frozen in their beds, travellers discovered as corpses when the snow melted. The Little Ice Age brought particularly brutal winters. The Thames River in London froze solid enough to hold frost fairs. Sounds charming until you realise this meant transportation of food and goods stopped completely. The winter of 1433-34 was so severe that wine froze in its barrels and had to be sold by weight rather than volume. Trees exploded from the cold as their sap froze and expanded. Medieval parishes kept death records, and they show clear patterns. Burials spiked in late winter and early spring, when food supplies ran lowest and cumulative effects of cold and malnutrition peaked. The psychological impact was crushing. Everyone knew someone who didn't survive winter. Death was so common it became mundane, until it was your child, your parent, your spouse. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew winter was trying to kill them, and they developed a complex relationship with the season. In art and literature, winter was portrayed as a bitter old man, death's companion, the season of sorrow. One 13th century English poem begins, "Winter awakens all my sorrow." The poet continues, "Now it is, and now it is not, as if it had never been." Speaking of life itself. But they also found ways to laugh. Dark humour was everywhere. Folk tales about drunks freezing to death were considered comedy. Villages held mock funerals for winter, symbolically burying the season. They sang bawdy songs about keeping warm in bed and told stories about foolish travellers who ignored weather warnings. Religion provided the framework for endurance. Winter suffering was God's test, spring was resurrection. The church calendar cleverly aligned with this. Lent's fasting coincided with late winter scarcity, Easter with spring's return. If you could just endure, salvation awaited. This wasn't just spiritual metaphor, it was psychological survival strategy. Medieval people also developed elaborate superstitions and rituals around winter. They'd leave bread out for spirits, hang holly to ward off evil. Evergreens symbolised life persisting through winter, and performed ceremonies to ensure spring's return. These weren't just primitive beliefs, they were psychological coping mechanisms, ways to feel some control over an uncontrollable situation. The brutal truth? You probably wouldn't make it. Not because you're weak, but because you're adapted to a world where cold is an inconvenience, not a killer. Where hunger means skipping lunch, not watching your children waste away. Where disease is treated with antibiotics, not prayer and bloodletting. Medieval peasants survived through a combination of generational knowledge, communal support, and sheer biological toughness that most modern people have never needed to develop. They accepted suffering and death as constants, found grim humour in their circumstances, and clung to whatever hope religion and community could provide. Every aspect of medieval winter was trying to kill you. The cold that seeped through walls made of mud and dung. The smoke that filled your lungs while you huddled around the fire. The diet that left you vulnerable to a dozen different diseases. The accidents waiting in every icy step. Every overloaded roof beam. Every spark from the hearth. The diseases that spread through cramped quarters like wildfire through thatch. Yet somehow, some of them survived. Through communal effort, inherited wisdom, and a relationship with suffering that modern people can barely comprehend, they endured winters that would break most of us within weeks. They sang songs in the darkness, told stories by the smoke-filled fire, and counted the days until spring with a patience born of having no other choice. So next time winter inconveniences you, when the heating bill is high, when you're scraping ice off your windshield, when the store runs out of your favourite soup, remember the peasants who sat in their smoke-filled hovels, wrapped in wool and resignation, counting the days until spring while death knocked at their door. They faced winter with tools we'd consider primitive and odds we'd consider impossible. Some of them even lived to tell about it. That's medieval winter, nature's way of asking how badly you want to see spring. For most of us modern folk dropped into that world, the answer would be irrelevant. We wouldn't survive long enough to find out.